Most people think the Chernobyl disaster began at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986. But the truth is, the fuse wasn't lit that night. It was lit 4 years earlier, and the Soviet Union spent those 4 years pretending they couldn't smell the smoke. We've all seen the documentaries about the stupid mistakes made by the night shift, or the minute-by-minute countdown to the explosion. We've heard about the men who stayed at their posts while the world literally split open. But what if I told you that's only half the truth? What if I told you that the countdown didn't actually start in 1986? The real disaster, the moment the outcome became a mathematical certainty, happened in 1982. And the craziest part? It happened in the exact same power plant, with the exact same reactor design, and almost the exact same mechanical failure. If the Soviet Union had just listened to the warning shot fired by reactor number 1 in 1982, the city of Pripyat would still be full of families today. The schools wouldn't be silent, and there would be no 1,000-square-mile exclusion zone. Today, we're going beyond the tropes. We aren't just retreading the same old timeline, we are looking at the secret history of that forgotten 1982 accident, the rejected engineering fixes that could have saved thousands, and the systemic culture of silence that turned a manageable flaw into a global catastrophe. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll realize that Chernobyl wasn't just a freak accident. It was a series of deliberate, bureaucratic choices. To understand why 1986 happened, we have to travel back to September 1982. At this point, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was the jewel of the Soviet energy sector. Reactor 1 was the reliable workhorse of the fleet. During a routine startup, something went catastrophically wrong. Imagine you're driving a car down a steep hill. You tap the brakes to maintain your speed, but instead of slowing down, the car suddenly surges forward. You hit the brakes harder, and the car accelerates even faster. That is essentially what happened inside Reactor 1. A fuel channel ruptured, causing the cooling water to stop flowing. Within seconds, a portion of the nuclear fuel melted down. It was a partial core collapse, the absolute nightmare scenario. Now, in almost any other country, this would be a stop-everything moment. You'd pull the entire fleet of reactors offline until you fixed the defect. But this was the USSR in the early 80s. The KGB stepped in immediately. They didn't just clean up the mess, they erased the event from history. They told the workers to keep their mouths shut and classified the reports as top secret. They basically told the world that nothing had happened. They chose to keep making electricity rather than admit their technology was flawed. But here's the bit of information you won't hear in standard retellings. The brave engineers who investigated the 1982 accident actually found the smoking gun. They realized that the RBMK reactor had a fundamental flaw called a positive void coefficient. To keep it simple, think of most reactors like a fireplace where, if you throw water on the logs, the fire goes out. But the RBMK was like a fire that gets hotter the more water you throw on it. In certain conditions, if the cooling water turned to steam, the reactor wouldn't slow down. It would actually speed up. It was inherently unstable by design. The investigators suggested a simple, physical fix. Change the tips of the control rods. These rods are the brakes of a reactor. In the RBMK, these brakes had graphite tips, which, for a few seconds when first inserted, actually increased the reaction instead of stopping it. If they had changed those tips in 1982, the 1986 explosion would have been physically impossible. But the Soviet higher-ups looked at the cost and the time it would take to shut down every reactor, and they said no. They chose a cheap, fast reactor over a safe one. They bet the lives of millions on the hope that nobody would ever push the reactor into that specific danger zone again. They gambled with the laws of physics, and they lost. To understand why this was so dangerous, we have to talk about the invisible shield that Chernobyl was missing, a containment structure. If you look at a nuclear plant in the US or Europe, you'll see a massive, thick, reinforced concrete dome. Its only job is to stay there and do absolutely nothing, unless everything goes wrong. If the core explodes, the dome catches the radiation. It's like a helmet for the reactor. The designers of the RBMK reactor skipped the helmet. Why? Because the RBMK was massive. Building a dome big enough to cover it would have cost millions of extra rubles and delayed Soviet energy goals by years. They convinced themselves that an explosion was impossible. They literally wrote in their safety manuals that the RBMK was so safe it could be built in the middle of a city. This is the avoidance point most people miss. We always blame the operators, but we rarely talk about the architects who built a massive pressure cooker and then refused to give it a safety valve. But the warnings didn't stop in 1982. In 1985, an engineer named Volkov sent another urgent warning. He noticed that when the control rods were lowered into the core, the act meant to save the reactor, they caused a brief, violent surge in power first. He called it the positive scram. The emergency stop button, the famous big red AZ5 button, was actually an accelerate button for the first few seconds of its travel. It was fundamentally rigged to fail at the exact moment you needed it most. Volkov's warning was buried. Admitting the button was broken meant admitting the entire Soviet nuclear program was a house of cards. So, they kept the secret. They left the accelerate button labeled as emergency stop, and they waited for a disaster they knew was coming. Now we're back at the moment everyone knows, April 26, 1986. But look at it through our new lens. The famous safety test that night was actually trying to make the plant safer. But they ran the test at low power, where the reactor becomes poisoned and behaves like an unpredictable animal. Akimov, the shift foreman, wasn't a villain. He saw the reactor acting strangely and told his boss, Dyatlov, that they should stop. But Dyatlov yelled at him to continue. Here is the ultimate pivot point. If the 1982 accident hadn't been a state secret, Akimov would have had the authority to stand his ground. He could have pointed to the 1982 files and said, "We know what happens when this reactor is pushed at low power. It melts." Because that information was suppressed, Akimov didn't have the why. He just had a bad feeling. In the rigid Soviet hierarchy, a bad feeling didn't win arguments against a superior. Akimov was forced to fly blind into a storm that had been predicted 4 years earlier. At 1:23 a.m., when the reactor began to shake, Akimov finally pushed that red AZ5 button. He reached for the brakes, but because of the ignored warning of 1982, the rejected design fix of the control rods, and the missing containment dome, those brakes didn't stop the reactor. They acted as the detonator. The graphite tips entered the core, caused a massive spike in reactivity, and the steam pressure blew the 1,000-ton roof right through the ceiling. This brings us to a part of the story most people overlook, the missed opportunity in the minutes after the explosion. Even with the roof gone, the leadership refused to believe it. They sent young men to their deaths to turn valves that were already melted. If they had simply accepted the impossible reality, a reality the 1982 accident hinted at, they could have begun the evacuation of Pripyat immediately, saving thousands from the highest doses of fallout. So, what's the real takeaway? Chernobyl is often framed as a story of stupid mistakes by incompetent men. But when you look at the 1982 warning, you realize it was actually a story of institutional arrogance. It was the arrogance of a system that believed it could classify the laws of physics as state secrets. The lesson here isn't just about nuclear physics, it's for all of us. When we ignore the warning shots in our lives because fixing them is too expensive or embarrassing, we are essentially building our own version of Reactor Block 4. If the Soviet Union had spent a few thousand rubles on longer control rods and been honest about the 1982 failure, they wouldn't have had to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a sarcophagus. Chernobyl could have been prevented. All it would have taken was the courage to tell the truth 4 years earlier. But I want to hear from you. Do you think the Soviet Union would have survived if they had been honest about their failures? Or was the disaster inevitable the moment they chose secrecy over safety? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you want to see more forensic deep dives into the disasters that changed our world, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a nuclear plant isn't the radiation, it's the silence.